Eva, hey, congratulations on your new
Thank you.
documentary, Goodbye Horses, The Many Lives of Q Lazzarus.
Thank you so much.
You know what? I didn't know about this story. I've heard the song before. Really didn't think too much about it, but could you tell us why you wanted to make this documentary about Q Lazzarus?
Well, I was a big fan of that song, Goodbye Horses. I used to always play it when I DJ'd. I'm a filmmaker, but I used to DJ here in New York City. I knew a little bit about Q. I knew she'd been a taxi driver in the 80s and that Jonathan Demme had gotten into her cab and heard her music and put her music in his next four films. And it was in Silence of the Lambs where I first heard the song. And then I knew that she had completely vanished in the mid 90s and that not even her best friends or bandmates knew what had happened to her. So there was just a lot of mystery surrounding her, what had happened to her, but also just what her life had been, who she was, what other music she had made. And I'd actually, it had crossed my mind that I would love to make a documentary about her, but I said, well, how do I find her? And then just by chance, in August 2019, I called a car service and she was my driver and I recognized her. I figured out that it was her. So it wasn't so much something that I decided to do. It was something I wanted to do and then it came to me, the opportunity and the meeting. It was a total chance encounter, coincidence, but it also felt very fated to both of us.
It is an amazing story, the fact that you just coincidentally bumped into her in the same in the same driver pickup. It almost seems like the universe was telling you to make this documentary in its
Mhm.
own way.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that were sort of unusual that helped me figure out that it was her and that helped us meet because normally she would drive at night, but that day she had a client that had sort of booked her for the whole day and he was in meetings, so she decided just pick up another passenger and I guess she was near my home. And I normally don't take cars during the day. I take the subway, but I was running really late. But also, maybe the biggest thing was her GPS wasn't working. So she started going completely the wrong way. And, I said, oh, we were supposed to make a left on Flatbush Avenue, which is the avenue that, takes that leads to Manhattan from my part of Brooklyn. And she said, oh, I don't know what that is. Like, you tell me, baby, this is your town. And I said, well, where do you live? I thought maybe she was going to say like New Jersey and she said Staten Island. And a few months before that, I had read an article in Dazed and Confused where a journalist had tried to find her. They said, well, her real name was Diane Luckey. They said there's a Diane Luckey living in Staten Island, and they actually went to the house and knocked on the door and were told that she didn't live there. She was there. It was her husband who came out and said that, but she didn't want to be found, especially not by somebody that was just knocking on her door. But I'd read that article, so I had the Staten Island thing in my head. And when she told me she lived in Staten Island, and also, she was an African American woman, she was around the right age, like late 50s, and she was listening to Neil Young Harvest, the album, and it was a CD that she was listening to. So that too was another clue. I said, well, a lot of drivers just listen to the radio, but she had her own CD collection there. So I said, okay, this is someone who cares about music. So yeah, so there were a lot of sort of little clues and things that sort of led to this meeting. When after I sort of asked her if she knew, I asked her if she knew who Q Lazzarus was, because I was sort of just wanted to see how she would react. And she said, oh, I've heard of her. And then when I was about to get out of the car, she turned and said, hi, nice to meet you, Eva. I'm Q. And I wound up giving her my number. I said, can we get a lunch or a cocktail? She said, let me think about it. Give me your number. So I put my number in her phone. She went on her way. And then she called me the next morning and said she'd had a dream that she was performing and I was there. And she said, if there's something I learned from my dead mama, it's to not ignore signs from God. And, she took it all as a sign, that she had this dream. And yeah, there were just a lot of like little things that kind of made us both feel like it was fated.
It's amazing because for a woman who didn't want to be found, you managed to convince her
Hmm.
to partake in
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
documentary. And she seems very sociable and willing to do this
Hmm.
film.
Definitely. So, another thing was the timing of it, because by the time we met, her son was a senior in college. So she also said, "Oh, I've raised my son. Maybe I can go back to my music." So it was really the first time in almost 20, 25, 30 years that she had considered the idea of going back to her music and to being Q Lazzarus again. She was born Diane Luckey, then she became Q Lazzarus, then she became Diane Luckey again, and then she was like, "Okay, I'll go back again. I'm going to resurrect Q Lazzarus."
What about the other subjects in this film? You also had to dig around them to
Mhm.
find them in order to
Mhm.
to complete this documentary.
Yeah, so most of them, like the bandmates in England, and a lot of them I found on Facebook. Danny Z, who's Dan Agron, who was, her best friend and one of her collaborators here in New York. They made some house music together. I knew that he'd been a dancer, and I found a picture of him he'd been working at a Pilates studio because he's a Pilates instructor now. So I contacted the Pilates studio and tracked him down that way. So yeah, it was mostly on, the internet, social media, just doing some detective work because Q had, lost touch with everybody. She didn't have a computer, she didn't have social media, she wasn't on the internet very much at all.
The documentary showed many tragic sides to
Mhm.
Q Lazarus. What was
Mhm.
the most shocking to you as you progress on this journey with her?
I'm trying to not talk about a lot of the really dark stuff too much because it was very important to her that people find out about it through watching the film in her own
Mhm.
words, which is how her own family found out about most of it when they watched the film. They came to the premiere. So, because it's stuff that just sort of read or heard out of context without seeing the film and having her tell the story and how one thing led to the other. There are things that could just be that she could be judged about. Yeah, I mean, she went through a lot of very heavy things. One thing very that really jumped out at me was how she wasn't jaded despite having gone through all these really heavy things. Even when she's telling stories about these awful things that happened, there's always humor. I think it's all a testament to what a strong woman she was, because not only did she survive all of this and not become like a bitter person, but also the strength that it takes to keep all of this secret, to keep your whole past and your identity and all this wonderful music that you've made and all these experiences you've had, to just keep them secret for 25 years and not tell anyone about them, and also requires a great deal of willpower. But yeah, I mean, it was obviously just things that happened to her in New York, and it was sort of when things sort of spiraled out of control for her.
So true, so true. With any type of music documentaries, is always a challenge is the music itself, because
Hmm.
when it comes to trying to get the rights to music, you don't know who has the ownership or where it is now and the licensing. Could you tell us about your process of trying to get Q Lazarus music inputted into your film?
So there's all the other stuff that had never been released that she had. Luckily, her sister had, her sister Abby had kept all these tapes and all her flyers and all her stuff safe during the years where Q was struggling. And so Q had all this stuff. So she gave me like a huge bag of cassettes and DATs and demos, and I digitized everything. And so, all the unreleased music, the stuff she did with her band in London, the stuff she did with Danny Z, the house music, all of that. I didn't use all of it in the film, but I used like 22, 23 tracks, including one instrumental one. And I chose the stuff that I felt was strongest, but also stuff that worked with her biography, because
Mhm.
these songs are literally the soundtrack to her life. So that process, and then I helped James, her son, who's set up a record deal with Sacred Bones Records for the soundtrack. So that part was sort of straightforward. I helped her also like copyright everything because she hadn't done that. The Goodbye Horses piece, was a different story, and it continues to be a complicated situation in terms of royalties and rights and stuff. As you know, if Q hadn't met Jonathan Demme, if she hadn't Jonathan Demme hadn't gotten into a taxi and he hadn't heard her music and put Goodbye Horses in two of his movies, Married to the Mob and Silence of the Lambs, probably no one would know that song existed. It would probably have wound up
Hmm.
in the garbage, when Bill Garvey died, or who's the friend that she made, recorded the song with. As is discussed in the film, she definitely came up with sort of the harmonies, dispute over whether or not she was one of the songwriters or not. Bill Garvey definitely wrote the lyrics. Some people say that Gloriana Galicia, who worked with Bill and Q in my film, says that, she helped write some of the piano music, the keyboard music, and it had been registered originally under Q&B Publishing, which was Q and Bill. But then that wasn't really a real entity. And then when she disappeared, he recopywrote it in his name only. And then he passed away. And then his sisters had the copyright, the publishing, and now it seems like MGM and Universal have it. So it was a big rabbit hole, especially for my music supervisor, to try and figure out who owned the rights to this. What we do know is that Q, up until now that the Sacred Bones release has come out as of last Friday, February 21st, that Q never got, or her family never got any royalties for that song, except for what Jonathan gave her to use it in the two movies. She never got any, regardless of the publishing, songwriting. She should have still probably gotten, artist royalties for singing it.
Hmm. Hmm.
If you look at any pop singer who sings a song that they didn't write, they're still getting, you think they're not making any money from that song just because they didn't write it? Like, of course not. They're the voice, they're the face, they're the name. So Q was definitely taken advantage of, by many people she collaborated with, people that didn't know her, that got hold of the music and released it. It's been the hope. The film, part of the reason she wanted to do the film also was, because we were going to finally try and get her a record deal, and she wanted to go back to her music, and she wanted to tell these stories, and she also wanted to, sort of right these wrongs and show that, that she was taken advantage of, because first it was during her disappearance. There was a lot of certainly between Q and Bill Garvey, there was some tension over the song. When
Hmm.
Goodbye Horses came out, when Silence of the Lambs came out in the early 90s, she was in London and she was performing it with her band in London. And I think Bill Garvey wasn't very happy about that. Again, like she was the singer, and they put the name Q Lazzarus on the song, which was her name. And in the music video, it's just her. He wasn't there. So it's not very clear what the arrangement was. I think probably there was no arrangement, and then it just kind of got messy. So.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you started the filming, I want to say in 2019, and
Mhm,
you continue it for years later,
mhm.
even through the pandemic. Was there any concern that the pandemic could have derailed your documentary?
Oh, it definitely did, without a doubt. We were like charging full speed ahead, 2019, early 2020. I had a cinematographer, I had a sound recordist. There was a lot of like energy behind the film. And then, COVID started less than 6 months later, and we stopped filming entirely, and then little by little, like, Q and I started filming again, but it was just me and her. So I wound up doing, like, at that point, the camera work, the sound recording, and things that I really would rather not be doing. But it did obviously add an intimacy to that footage, made us very close. And then, since the film was going to end with her comeback concert and her reunion with her bandmates from London, between the travel bans and like the vaccines and all this stuff, like 2020 went by, 2021 went by. She had to have a hip replacement, which was delayed because of COVID, because all sort of non-urgent surgeries were delayed. And so that happened. When that finally happened, that created another delay, and we were waiting, we were just waiting constantly. And then finally, when things were starting to open up again, and, with COVID, and we had some big producers on board, and, we were going to have like get the money to finish it, that's when she fell down, broke her leg, and had another surgery, which, she never wound up going back home after that, and,
Mm.
got sepsis.
Yes,
Um,
it certainly is a tragic story after tragic
yeah,
story.
yeah.
Eva, you brought a great story to life and
Hmm.
answered many questions with Goodbye Horses. So
Hmm.
we appreciate your conversation about it,
Hmm.
and thank you very much for bringing to light the story of Q Lazzarus for audiences everywhere.
Of course. Thank you so much.